This is Caught in the Act with Tim Clarke.
And welcome back. It began with a man and then a boy. Both disturbed, both armed with a knife, and both intent on extreme harm.
Movements of the Bondi Junction killer in the lead-up to the shocking knife attack are being investigated by police. Joel Cauchi killed 6 people and wounded 12 more.
Breaking news out of Sydney's western suburbs, where a Christian bishop and worshippers have been stabbed in a terrifying incident that was streamed live around the world.
Both horrific actions were captured in real time, and the images of the knife, of the death, the horror, the shock, and the grief then broadcast to the world. The mainstream media showed what they needed to, what they could, amid the strict controls which govern what can be shown by an Australian media company. On social media, no such control. No blurring of the images, only a deeper blurring of the lines of what is acceptable to say and show by anyone with an account and an opinion, no matter how hateful or hurtful or just plain wrong. And seemingly unstoppable, a wave after wave of misinformation crashing over whomever the algorithms discern might be interested. Which perhaps makes Julie Inman-Grant Australia's own Queen Canute, trying to stop the tide. Australia's e-safety commissioner stood up and called for those images, particularly those live-streamed from inside that church, to be taken down by Facebook, TikTok and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. And it was that final frontier, owned by billionaire Elon Musk, who resisted by citing censorship and free speech and saying the posts did not violate X's rules on violent speech. And in another twist, Bishop Mary Emanuel, the man who was stabbed on that live stream, said he would like the images of the attack to remain online.
I would be of great concern if people use the attack on me to serve their own political interests, to control free speech.
Australia's leaders strongly disagreed, using powers under the Online Safety Act to issue notices to remove so-called Class 1 material. And after more posturing, government lawyers marched into the federal court and then marched out again with an injunction, which said that X should remove the posts not only in Australia, but across the world, along with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, having his own say.
This is an egotist. He is someone who's totally out of touch with the values that Australian families have.
Joining us on Caught in the Act this week to discuss the issues surrounding the case of the E-Safety Commissioner versus X Corp is Dr. Dana McKay, Associate Dean of Interaction, Technology and Information in the School of Computing Technologies at RMIT University. Dr. McKay, thanks so much for joining us on Caught in the Act this week.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you're keen to stress off the top, you're not a legal scholar, but you are an expert in technology and information and how they intersect and then influence all of us to some extent.
That's right, yeah. So don't ask me for legal advice because it would be bad and I can't give it anyway.
And so while this power play between Australia and Elon Musk and X has ended up in court, it's much more than a legal contest, or it's certainly become that. It strikes me it's about politics and it's about power on both sides.
Absolutely. Look, this is not actually the first time this has happened in Australia. So we saw similar kinds of standoffs around the payment for news a few years ago. But at that point, it was most social media companies. And on this particular one, X has taken a stand that's different to other social media companies. So it'll be interesting to see it play out.
Yeah, because previously Mr. Zuckerberg has been the bogeyman and seen as the one who's sort of at war with Australia. So it's certainly in an online or tech space. But Meta has taken a completely different view than X this time, and they actually put up quite a long explanation of what they did and the interactions that they had with authorities almost immediately on that Saturday after the awful outcomes in Bondi. Why do you think they've done that? Why do you think they've gone down a different path?
I think maybe it's my view as a New Zealander, but I think partly it's what happened in Christchurch in early 2019, where that person who engaged in severe violence in mosques in New Zealand live streamed what he did over Facebook. And I think it kind of horrified the whole world, right? It wasn't just New Zealand that was horrified by what happened there, but Facebook at that point realized that they could be a vehicle for hatred and for violence. And maybe it's changed the kind of underlying DNA of the company where they're like, actually, no, this is not what we do. We're a place for advertisers to sell stuff and people to come together, and violence isn't part of that remit.
And then you've got, as you say, Musk seems, since his acquisition of Twitter and its amorphization into X, he seems to have gone completely the different way and seems determined that the hill he might die on is that this sort of free speech absolutism that you shouldn't ask for basically anything to be taken down.
So, yeah, he has definitely decided that he is serving a particular audience and a particular approach to things where essentially everything is allowed on X. And look, I think it's an interesting approach. There are rumors flying around that actually certain kinds of content is prioritized. So content that is less human rights focused, more human rights focused tends to get pushed down in the algorithm. Less human rights focused content tends to get pushed up. We know generally that social media algorithms, because they are designed to promote advertising to the people using the social media platforms, that's the business model, do promote content that spawns engagement, right? And really horrific content spawns engagement, at least in terms of people don't, necessarily immediately scroll past because your brain struggles to make sense of it, or people share it because they're like, oh, look at this horrible thing that happened, or they share it because it's become controversialist, as with the case with X. Having said that, I'd be really interested. No, I wouldn't be interested. I'd be horrified, probably. Let's be honest about this. But would Musk say the same thing if it were child exploitation material, for example? Does that fall within his views of free speech? I mean, even in the US where, there is this legal right to free speech, there are limits on it. You can't yell fire in a crowded theatre. So, at what point does Elon Musk believe that there should be limits on it, if at all? I think it's a very good question.
And from general users to expert commentators like yourself have seen the radical change in X's outlook and output since Musk's taken over. I mean, people call it the Wild West. A cesspool of whatever dregs of society might want to gather and then sort of garner attention. what it used to be, from a journalistic point of view, though, was a place that you could go when large live events were happening, good and bad, sporting, royal weddings, or disasters and tragedies, and be able to sort of rely on the information. Obviously, your own internal journalistic filter kicks in, but you could rely on it. It struck me that Bondi and then the church stabbing, that went completely out of the window, and you were second guessing everything you saw. Even the images that looked genuine, are they AI? I mean, these two events, it seems to me, were another Rubicon that was crossed.
So I think we've got a few things flying in close formation there. So I'm an academic. I used to love Twitter. Twitter is gone.
You don't hear that phrase much these days.
Twitter is gone and X is here, and I do not love X. None of the people I used to spend time with are there anymore, and it's not a place where you can have a sensible conversation. So it's very disappointing to see what's happened to it. So first of all, there were the changes to X that made it harder to control what you saw, harder to kind of cultivate the algorithms that presented things to you that you might find interesting. And at the same time, we've seen the rapid growth of AI image generation in the background, right, which also prompts us. The Pope in a puffer jacket thing has made us now, if we're, being cautious and thoughtful, question the things we see online. Is this true, or is it some AI-generated thing? So I think, and then the exodus of expert commentary and the ability to purchase a blue tick on Twitter, which used to be a signifier of something that meant someone was a genuine expert in something, have meant that there's this cluster on Twitter of circumstances that mean that it is very difficult to tell what's real anymore. We've got AI image generation, and I do note that Twitter did put a stop to the circulation of those AI-generated nudes of Taylor Swift, which was the right thing to do. But I wonder why that's different than a real stabbing. And you've got the loss of certification of expertise with the blue tick, and you've got a change in the user population of Twitter because Elon Musk's very public kind of, I guess I would even say, grandstanding about this is a free speech platform has attracted a certain kind of new user to the platform. So between all that, you've got a situation where, you do have to be cautious about what you see on X.
And coming back to the arguments from this week, in your opinion, is it about censorship, as some would have sort of the wider public believe? I mean, we had the extraordinary situation of a sitting senator, a representative of Clive Palmer's party, sort of reposting the vision of the stabbing of the priest on his social media platform as a sort of, personal protest against what the government was asking X Corp and Elon Musk to do.
I think what you think is censorship depends on your perspective on what you believe we should be able to access. Now, I personally don't think it's censorship to not feed essentially the narrative that if you do something horrible, you'll get lots of global attention. In New Zealand, after the Christchurch stabbings, the decision was broadly taken by media and society not to name the person who perpetrated those atrocities, and not to feed attention, to actually focus on the people who were harmed. And that was a deliberate decision, because that person who did those things had essentially done it in New Zealand because New Zealand was perceived as this lovely, peaceful place, and to bring attention to his viewpoint. Starving that sort of thing of attention has merit, right? But there's also another issue here with social media and the way it's designed, which is that, you can be scrolling along and something is surfaced to you that you did not want, that you did not anticipate, And I think this is one of the reasons why Facebook was so quick to take it down, because they recognised it was absolutely not the type of thing that their users expected to see unexpectedly. Now, something like 41% of Australians have experienced some kind of severe violence after the age of 15. So, you know, for any one of them, they could have developed PTSD as a result of that experience. Mm-hmm. And seeing something like this unexpectedly, which is how social media serves stuff up to you, could really have significant negative consequences for their mental health. So are we wrong to be protecting those 41%, or, you know, some proportion of those 41% of Australians who could have significant negative impacts from an experience of seeing something like that? I don't think we are. But, you know, I've been speaking to the media about this week, and there's a quote of mine that's floating around about how we as a society decide what's acceptable, and there are boundaries that we don't cross, including child exploitation material. And someone on X came back at me and said, no, I'm a member of society and I think adults should be able to see what they like. So, I mean, apparently people will argue that anything is censorship, which is kind of appalling, actually.
Yeah. Going back to the point about politics and power, from the Australian government's point of view, they obviously see no harm locally in being seen to be, you know, standing up to an American billionaire who's, you know, taken over Twitter and turned it more toxic.
Yeah, look, and I think that's right. I think we've been, because these spaces are free to use, we've been kind of lulled into the sense that they're public spaces, that they're parks, that they're public squares, that they're forums that aren't controlled by commercial interests. And that's just not true. You know, Twitter is controlled by commercial interests. Facebook is controlled by commercial interests. Google is controlled by commercial interests. And it's to the Australian government to look out for Australian interests, not multi-billion-dollar companies. And yes, there's a power play going on here, and it's quite an interesting one because it is revealing that, hey, these aren't public squares. But how it's going to play out will be quite interesting, I think.
Yeah. And then from Musk's point of view, it seems to me this is part his own personality, but also a part power play as well. And he will also surely know that other governments are going to be watching Australia to see how they go in terms of these injunctions going forward. I mean, the example of plain packaging of tobacco has been used this week. Sort of Australia did that, and then other countries followed. Do you think Musk and his posse will be sort of worried that if Australia sort of get this up and win this argument, at least in their own courts, that other governments might say, well, you know what, they can do it, so can we?
Look, he certainly should be concerned about that. And I think, you know, there are good arguments for societies deciding what role they want tech companies to play in their society. We also saw this with news, right? After we introduced the payment for news, that also happened in Canada and a few other countries. And those countries watched what happened in Australia, and yes, we got it through. So they went, okay, well, then we're going to do the same thing. So absolutely, social media companies should be watching and deciding what role they want to play in society, because they can either play by the rules of the countries in which they operate and be part of the society there or not. But the fact that they have all this money doesn't give them the right, I don't think, or I really hope, to just go, the rules don't apply to us, because that's essentially what Elon Musk is playing at here from my perspective.
And advertising, you mentioned that previously, and it would appear from the outside that since Twitter has become X, they've had issues in that space as well over the year, advertising revenues being cut into. Do you think this issue this week will, hurt the platform in that way?
Look, I think, again, it's perspective-based. There are some people who have extreme free speech views who will look at Twitter's platform and go, yeah, I'm going to advertise there because the people that I want to talk to are on that platform. Mm-hmm. There are some companies who will look at it and go, oh, that's horrific, and the people I want to talk to are probably going to leave that platform, or my shareholders are not going to be wanting me to be associated with that platform. The really interesting thing about advertising is that Musk took this extreme free speech approach, and then when advertisers withdrew their advertising dollars from the platform, was quite abusive about it, saying that they didn't have the right to do it. And so it seems actually that what Musk wants isn't true free speech, which is you can say what you like, but it might actually have some consequences. He wants speech with freedom from consequences, which is a completely different thing than free speech.
And on a practical level, is it even possible for X to remove whatever content they want once the genie is out of the bottle? Even this morning, opposition leader Peter Dutton said it might be a silly proposition to try and police the internet worldwide from a courtroom in Australia. Could they geo-block anything that related, or any images at least, that related to the stabbing in that church?
Look, I'm not entirely sure how the underpinnings of Twitter's image processing works. The fact that when those images of Taylor Swift were circulating, what they did was block searches for it rather than block the images themselves, suggests that they might not have underlying highly developed image processing capability. Whereas Facebook, for example, were able to essentially create a machine recognition of this type of content, anything related to those stabbings, and go, we can now detect it automatically as someone tries to post it. So as it's posted, it's pushed through a little filter, and the filter catches it and goes, no, this is of the same thing, and we don't post this on Facebook. Whether Twitter has that capability built in is unclear, but maybe they need to. So it is technologically possible to do. Whether it's technologically possible with Twitter's or X's current setup is an open question. But yeah, it is technologically possible.
You touched on it before, the argument about where should the line be drawn, and most right-minded members of society would think, well, child exploitation material, that is a line that should never be crossed. We have laws here in Western Australia, as they do in most states in Australia and beyond, about creating child exploitation material and transmitting it. Do you think there would ever come a time where a prosecuting authority would say, well, if you're allowing that material to be transmitted on your platform, you become the publisher, therefore you become liable for the transmission of that material from one entity to another?
This is a really interesting one, and the fact that search engines and therefore social media companies are not publishers under the law has historic roots that were almost necessary for the development of the technology, because essentially if you'd forced search engines to be responsible for everything they linked to way back in the beginning, they would never have been, it wouldn't have been technologically possible to develop them. The risk would have been simply too high that, they linked to bad advice, someone took it and a bad outcome happened. So that's why we have the technological setup that we've got at this point. However, we have seen things around copyright where, search engine companies have been really pushed to not link to, for example, sites that promote breaches of copyright, VPNs or whatever, sites that host whatever shows playing in the US for free so that you don't have to pay for it. And we have seen some editing of what's promoted in search engines on that front. We've also seen search engines pushed to essentially mitigate the damage of misinformation particularly around what's colloquially referred to as your money or your life type queries. So, not promoting misinformation that will cause people to lose significant sums of money, not promoting misinformation that might cause significant health outcomes for people, significant negative health outcomes for people. So we are seeing search engines in particular voluntarily take some of these steps, I think, to avoid exactly the kind of policing that we're talking about in terms of they become publishers and therefore liable for what's happening. Also because their shareholders don't want to be on the receiving end of the lawsuit when somebody drinks bleach to cure their COVID and the inevitable happens. So I think it's an interesting question. I think we could eventually see, the technology's developed now, and we're seeing other negative consequences of the free-for-all of you can suck up anything on the internet and do whatever you like with it in terms of AI as well. So I think we've got an interesting legal future ahead of us as we grapple with how we manage these very large companies who have significant power over what information we can and do access in society.
And one of our aldermen here, Andrew Twiggy Forrest, yesterday he's had his own ongoing battles with social media platforms over misinformation. He says involves him directly, AI generated adverts that are leading to people getting scammed. Yesterday he suggested that what the government could do is make these tech giants register their holdings in Australia as an Australian company, so they wouldn't then be able to hide behind laws in California, which his lawyers are now having to navigate in his ongoing legal battle with Facebook. Do you think that's a worthwhile suggestion?
Look, there are a ton of reasons why it's a worthwhile suggestion, including the way that many large multinationals structure their tax affairs, for example. We see large multinationals of all stripes, not just tech companies, structuring their tax affairs so that they pay very limited tax, despite the fact that they make significant sums of money in Australia. So I think there are good reasons for doing that generally, that if you want to operate in Australia, you have to operate in Australia. But whether we'll see that is an interesting question.
Yeah. And an interesting sidebar, Ms. Inman Grant, the Safety Commissioner, she's a former senior official at what was Twitter. She was once responsible for Twitter's corporate social responsibility efforts in Australia. So that makes her a big tech poacher turned gamekeeper, and she has been given significant powers. How have you seen how she's approached it, this issue this week?
Look, my hat is off to her because she has undoubtedly copped an awful lot of abuse over this. Women who speak up about such things online generally do cop an awful lot of abuse. And I think, to be honest, her history in that corporate social responsibility role has probably given her unique insight into exactly how this is going to play out at these companies. We've seen wave after wave of layoffs of AI ethics experts from big tech companies, which sends a signal, at least to me, that they want to do what they want to do without considering the ethics of it. And I personally think it's great we've got something like the E-Safety Commission that's going, hang on a minute, you do have to do the right thing by Australians, whether you're going to employ your people in-house or not.
So, Dr. McKay, you mentioned hats there. Put on a futurist one for us. Where does this battle between governments and big tech go, and where does it lead us? Where could it all end, do you think?
I mean,
big question. I know. Sorry.
Climate change is probably going to get us before we solve this one. Realistically, I think big tech has operated with impunity for a very long time. Big tech has been staffed and populated by a very small proportion the population, representatives from a very small proportion of the population. And they have, it was literally Facebook's motto for a long time, to move fast and break things. And I think the days of moving fast and breaking things are coming to an end. I think, these social media companies hold so much, and search companies hold so much power in society. They can literally determine what we see as information and truth as a society. And I think governments have suddenly gone, oh, this isn't actually the way we want things to go. So I think the day of reckoning is coming. What happens, I think we will see some places on the internet become more Wild West and become more fringe, and I think that's the way X is pushing. We'll see significant polarization in society for a time. I think eventually that will settle down, but we're seeing it already. Online activity is driving significant polarization. And again, I think governments are going to wake up to that one and go, oh, we don't want highly polarized societies. It's bad for everyone when societies are highly polarized. Whether the genie is out of the bottle in terms of the power that these companies have is an open question. It might be that it's already too late to rein it back in, but I think we're going to find out, and probably fairly soon.
And one last question. I've seen some argument this week that brands, mainstream media companies might begin to take the view, particularly with X, that a presence on that site or a presence on that platform legitimizes something that they don't want to be associated with. And so it struck me that if that started to happen, if brands started to come off there, if mainstream media started to come off there, surely those that got on there in the first place to use X or Twitter as a source of real time trustworthy information would start to come off there as well. And so surely once numbers start declining, that's the beginning of the end for a social media platform that relies on people and opinions and eyeballs.
Look, we've seen social media platforms come and go. Anyone remember MySpace or Bebo?
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, I am that old, just.
Yeah, me too, just. So, I think Musk is living in a world where X will be forever. And it's like, well, not necessarily. I do think that if he continues to push this fringe, and I hope I personally perceive it as fringe notion, that it's absolutely fine for anything to be shown on the internet. We will see people choosing to walk away because that is not a view that they subscribe to. It's not something with which they wish to be associated. I personally considered deleting my X account once and for all over this latest incident. And it will push X to the fringes. Now, some people will go, oh, actually, this isn't for me anymore. Some people will essentially double down and start to believe the things they're seeing because that is their whole kind of media world. And we know from propaganda studies done way back in the 1950s that consistent and pervasive messaging is what gets people to believe something. So if people are getting most of their messaging from X, they'll believe the dominant narratives on X, which is kind of scary and really unfortunate. But, there are fringe places on the internet. 4chan exists. Well, maybe X is going to be the new 4chan. But I do think that if Musk continues to push this, he can swear at advertisers all that he likes, but they will not want to be associated with this mess long term.
Dr. Dana McKay, thanks so much for joining us on Caught in the Act this week. Fascinating conversation about an issue that affects us all, whether we like it or not.
Thanks so much, Tim. It was lovely to chat with you.
And a quick postscript about one of those people that have walked away from that platform. His name is Eddie Perez. He was the former Twitter director for civic integrity. He went on to the platform this morning to announce that he was leaving, and he had some things to say on the way out. This isn't a story about free speech versus censorship. It's a story about who gets to wield the power of speech, and a cautionary tale of how massive private wealth enables an immature man-child to selectively elevate those who reject democracy's bedrock value, equality. The next appearance of the eSafety Commissioner versus Xcorp is on May the 10th, when lawyers from both sides will reconvene to talk about whether that injunction continues. Thanks to you all for joining us again. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us by writing to courtintheact@wanews.com.au. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell all your friends, family, colleagues, mums, dads and co-accused all about us. And remember, if you want to know what's going on in court, don't get caught short, get caught in the act instead. See you next week.